The blood-caked dust beneath Fiona Sullivan's bare feet told a story of desperation as she stumbled across the parched New Mexico Territory landscape. The year was 1875, and she had been running for what felt like days, though in reality, the sun had only risen and set twice since her escape. Her once fine dress was torn in a dozen places, her dark hair falling in wild tangles around her face, and the soles of her feet left crimson footprints in her wake. Behind her lay the smoldering remains of her past life, a wealthy Boston upbringing, a marriage arranged to a man who had revealed himself as a monster once they'd crossed the Mississippi, and the charred carcass of the stagecoach that had been carrying them west to his silver mine holdings. The Apaches who had attacked their coach had unwittingly granted her freedom she seized, while her husband Silas and his business associates were occupied in the firefight. Fiona had no destination in mind, only the burning need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who had beaten her nightly since their wedding 3 months ago. A man who had already killed one wife, as she had discovered from his drunken confessions. A man who would hunt her to the ends of the earth once he discovered she hadn't perished in the attack. The horizon wavered in the heat as Fiona stumbled forward. Her tongue felt swollen in her parched mouth, and her vision had begun to blur. She could no longer feel the pain in her feet, a bad sign, she knew. The small canteen she had grabbed from the coach had run dry hours ago. A distant sound caught her attention, hoofbeats. Panic surged through her exhausted body, providing one last burst of energy as she forced herself into a staggering run. It had to be Silas. He had found her trail. The sound grew louder, closer. Fiona pushed harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. But her body had reached its limit. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving ground. The hoofbeats slowed. Through tear-blurred eyes, she looked up to see not her husband but a tall stranger atop a chestnut mare. Broad-shouldered and sun-browned, he wore a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes, trail-worn clothes, and a gun belt that had clearly seen use. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and cautious as he dismounted, keeping his distance as if approaching a wounded animal. "You can stop running now." Fiona tried to scramble backward, leaving bloody smears in the dust. "Stay away," she croaked. The man crouched, still keeping several feet between them. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Name's Ross Vance. I've got water." At the mention of water, Fiona froze. The man Ross slowly reached for his canteen, uncapped it, and set it down halfway between them. The gesture seemed so deliberately unthreatening that Fiona found herself reaching for it despite her fear. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. She gulped greedily until a gentle hand touched her wrist. "Easy now. Too much too fast will make you sick." Fiona reluctantly lowered the canteen, taking in the man's features more carefully. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a short beard covering his jaw. His eyes, though they were a startling blue against his tanned skin, and they held none of the cold cruelty she had come to expect from men. "What's got you running barefoot through Apache territory?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her bloodied feet. "My husband," she whispered, then hesitated. Would this stranger return her to Silas for a reward? "He's dead," she lied. "Killed in an Apache attack. I ran. I've been running ever since." Ross Vance's eyes narrowed slightly, and Fiona knew he'd caught her lie. Her heart began to race again. "Reckon the dead don't often inspire this kind of terror," he said quietly. "But that's your business." He stood slowly. "My cabin's about 3 hours' ride from here. You can clean up, rest, then decide what you want to do next. Or I can take you to the nearest town, Silver Creek's about a day's ride south. Fiona weighed her options. Towns meant people, questions, and the possibility that news of her would reach Sila's. But going alone with this stranger to his isolated cabin carried its own risks. "Why would you help me?" she asked. A shadow passed over Ross's face. "Let's just say I know something about running from things that hurt you." He gestured to his horse. "Can you stand?" Fiona tried and failed, pain lancing through her abused feet now that some feeling had returned. Without asking permission, Ross bent and lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her gently on his horse before mounting behind her. "I'll need a name to call you by," he said as he turned the horse north. "Fiona," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Fiona Sullivan." "Well, Miss Sullivan, hold tight. We've got rough country ahead." As they rode, Fiona found herself leaning back against the solid warmth of Ross Vance's chest, her eyes growing heavy despite her wariness. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something close to safe. The cabin appeared as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, a sturdy log structure nestled against a rocky outcropping, with a small corral and lean-to stable to one side. A creek gurgled nearby, the sound of running water making Fiona realize how desperately she longed to be clean. "It ain't much," Ross said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it keeps the weather out." Inside, the cabin was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall opposite a small kitchen area. A table with 2 chairs sat in the center, and a curtain partitioned off what Fiona assumed was a sleeping area. Everything spoke of a solitary existence: one plate, one cup on the shelf, one chair pulled close to the fireplace. "You live alone?" she asked as he helped her to a chair. "Just me and Sadie," he nodded toward the horse visible through the window. "No wife, family?" Something darkened in his expression. "Not anymore." He busied himself with examining her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large, calloused hands. "These need cleaning. I'll heat some water." While Ross built up the fire and set a pot of water to warm, Fiona took in more details of his home. A rifle stood in one corner, well maintained. A few books were stacked on a small shelf. She could make out titles by Twain and Whitman. Not what she'd expected from a frontier cabin. "You read poetry?" she asked, surprised. Ross glanced up from the fire. "Man's got to feed his mind as well as his body out here. Gets quiet otherwise." When the water was ready, he knelt before her with a basin and clean cloth. "This is going to hurt," he warned before beginning to clean the dirt and blood from her lacerated feet. Fiona bit her lip against the pain, tears welling in her eyes. Ross worked methodically, removing embedded thorns and gravel, washing away the blood to reveal the raw damage beneath. "How far did you run?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. 2 days, maybe more. I lost track." He shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. Between the Apaches, rattlers, and lack of water, most folks wouldn't have made it half as far." "I had no choice," Fiona whispered. Ross looked up, meeting her eyes. "Must have been something mighty terrible to run from." For a moment, Fiona nearly told him everything about Silas's cruelty, his drunken rages, the bruises she hid beneath her clothing, and the whispered threats of what would happen if she ever tried to leave. About discovering that his first wife hadn't died of fever as he claimed, but had been beaten to death in a remote cabin much like this one. Instead, she simply said, "It was." Ross nodded, asking no more as he finished cleaning her wounds and applied a pungent salve that stung fiercely before numbing the pain. "This is bear grease mixed with some herbs the Navajo taught me about," he explained as he wrapped her feet in clean strips of cloth. "It'll help with healing." "You learned medicine from the Navajo, spent some time with them after the war, learned a lot of things." He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You must be hungry. I've got venison stew from yesterday." The stew was simple but flavorful, and Fiona realized she was ravenous. She ate 2 bowlfuls while Ross talked of inconsequential things: the weather, his small garden patch, the mountain lion he'd spotted last week. He asked no questions about her past, and she offered none, grateful for the reprieve. As night fell, Ross built up the fire and hung a blanket across the room, creating a private space for her. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Too exhausted to protest, Fiona limped to the rough-hewn bed, sinking into its surprising comfort. Clean, fed, and sheltered for the first time in days, she fell into a deep sleep despite her unfamiliar surroundings. She woke screaming sometime in the night, Silas's face vivid in her nightmare. Ross was immediately at her side, keeping a respectful distance but speaking in low, soothing tones until her panic subsided. "He won't find you here," Ross said, though he couldn't possibly know who he was. "You don't understand," Fiona whispered. "He'll never stop looking." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Ross replied, his voice firm with certainty. "For now, you're safe." Over the next few days, as Fiona's feet slowly healed, a cautious routine developed between them. Ross would leave at dawn to check his traps or hunt, returning by midday. Fiona, confined to the cabin by her injuries, took over cooking and mending his clothes, grateful to have useful tasks to occupy her mind. They spoke little of their pasts, but in small ways they began to know each other. Ross whistled when he was thinking, old Civil War tunes that he'd learned as a cavalry scout for the Union. Fiona hummed while she worked, songs her Irish grandmother had taught her. Ross took his coffee black and strong enough to stand a spoon in. Fiona preferred hers with a spoonful of honey from the wild bee's nest Ross had discovered. On the 4th evening, as they sat before the fire, Ross finally asked the question Fiona had been dreading. "Your husband, he's not dead, is he?" Fiona stared into the flames. "No. And he's the kind of man who puts fear like I saw in your eyes." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "Is he looking for you?" "Yes, he killed his first wife. I found letters. When I confronted him, he beat me so badly I couldn't leave our room for a week." The words came tumbling out now, unstoppable. "He was taking me west to his mining claim, somewhere isolated where no one would hear or help. The Apache attack was my only chance. I grabbed what I could and ran while they were fighting." Ross was silent for a long moment. "What's his name?" "Silas Sullivan. He's a silver baron from Boston, but he made his fortune out here during the war." "I know of him," Ross said grimly. "His reputation reaches even out here." Fear clutched at Fiona's heart. Will you turn me in if he comes looking?" Ross's expression hardened. "I fought a war to free people from bondage, Miss Sullivan. I don't aim to deliver anyone back to it." "Thank you," Fiona whispered, tears of relief stinging her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. If he's as determined as you say, this cabin won't stay a secret forever." "I should leave," Fiona said, though the thought of facing the wilderness again terrified her. "I'm putting you in danger by staying. And where would you go? Your feet still need time to heal properly." "I could try to reach California. He might not look for me there." Ross shook his head. "That's 800 miles of the most unforgiving country you can imagine. Desert, mountains, hostile tribes, and not many friendly faces in between." "I have no other choice," Fiona insisted. "You have choices," Ross said firmly. "They just might not be easy ones." He stood, pacing the small room. "You could petition for divorce in the territorial court." Fiona gave a bitter laugh. "With what evidence? What lawyer? Silas owns judges from here to San Francisco, or you could." Ross hesitated. "You could remarry." "A husband has legal rights that would supersede Sullivan's claims." Fiona stared at him. Who would marry a runaway wife with nothing to her name and a dangerous man hunting her? Ross met her gaze steadily. Someone with his own reasons to help. The implication hung in the air between them, shocking Fiona into silence. Ross quickly raised his hands. "I'm not proposing, Miss Sullivan, just laying out options." He turned toward the door. "I need to check on Sadie, think on it." Left alone, Fiona's mind whirled. Marriage of convenience was not uncommon on the frontier, she knew, and Ross Vance had shown himself to be honorable, kind even in his gruff way. But to tie herself to another man so soon after escaping Sela's. When Ross returned, Fiona had composed herself. "I appreciate the suggestion, Mr. Vance, but I cannot ask that of you." He nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Fair enough, we'll find another way." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question that had plagued her from the beginning. "You don't know me." Ross was quiet for so long that Fiona thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and distant, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "I had a wife once, Sarah, and a daughter, Emma. We had a small ranch in Colorado." His hands tightened on the chair back he was gripping. "While I was away selling our cattle, men came claim jumpers who wanted our water rights. He stopped, swallowed hard. "They hurt Sarah badly. By the time I got back, she'd taken her own life. Emma was gone, they'd taken her. I tracked them for months, but I never found her." Horror washed over Fiona. "I'm so sorry." "I couldn't save them," Ross said simply, "but maybe I can help you." The next morning, Ross announced he needed to ride into Silver Creek for supplies. "I'll ask around, see if there's any word about Sullivan in these parts. I won't mention you," he added quickly, seeing Fiona's alarm. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, trying to mask her anxiety. 2 days there and back. Will you be all right alone?" Fiona nodded, though the thought of being left in the isolated cabin made her pulse quicken. "I'll be fine." Ross showed her where he kept a loaded rifle and how to bar the door securely. "If anyone comes who isn't me, hide in the root cellar," he instructed, showing her a trapdoor beneath a rug that led to a small storage space below the cabin. After he'd gone, the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. Fiona kept herself busy cleaning, baking bread with the supplies Ross had left and tending to the small garden. Her feet were healing well enough that she could walk short distances, though the tender new skin still protested. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the settling logs, every hoot of an owl outside sent her heart racing. By morning, her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but she forced herself to continue with her tasks. Late in the afternoon of the second day, as Fiona was drawing water from the creek, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her. Ross was back early. She straightened, a smile forming on her lips, only to freeze in terror. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, and none was Ross. Leading them was a face from her nightmares, Ross Sullivan, his elegant clothing incongruous against the wild backdrop, his handsome face set in lines of cruel determination. Fiona dropped the water bucket and ran for the cabin, her partially healed feet screaming in protest. She had to reach the rifle, the root cellar, but she was too late. Silas spurred his horse forward, cutting off her path. "My darling wife," he said, his cultured Boston accent a mockery of gentility. "How touching to find you playing frontier housewife. How did you find me?" Fiona gasped, backing away. Silas dismounted, his movement fluid and predatory. The 2 men with him, rough-looking hired guns, remained on their horses, watching impassively. It wasn't difficult. A woman traveling alone leaves an impression, particularly one as memorable as you. He reached for her, and Fiona flinched away. Now, is that any way to greet your loving husband, after I've searched so diligently for you?" "You're not my husband," Fiona spat, finding courage in her desperation. You're a monster. Silas's handsome face twisted with rage. He grabbed her arm, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. You are my property, Fiona. Mine to do with as I please. The law is quite clear on that point. Let her go, came a steely voice from the edge of the clearing. Ross Vance sat atop Sadie, his rifle aimed steadily at Silas's head. Fiona nearly sobbed with relief. Silas didn't release her, but his grip slackened slightly as he turned toward Ross. And who might you be, sir? The backwoods paramour who's been harboring my runaway wife, name's Ross Vance, and you're trespassing on my property. I'm merely retrieving what belongs to me, Silas replied smoothly. This woman is my lawfully wedded wife. She doesn't seem eager to accompany you, Ross observed, his rifle unwavering. Silas's two men had shifted their positions, hands hovering near their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Mr. Vance, is it? Silas's tone was conversational now. I'm a reasonable man. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies everyone. I'm not for sale, Fiona interjected fiercely. Silas's fingers tightened again, making her wince. You mistake the situation, my dear. You have no say in this matter. Let her go, Ross repeated, a dangerous edge to his voice. Now, for a moment no one moved. Then Silas gave a cold smile and released Fiona's arm. Very well, let's discuss this like civilized men. The standoff continued for several tense heartbeats before Ross slowly lowered his rifle, though Fiona noticed he kept it ready across his lap. Miss Sullivan came here injured and in need of help, Ross said. I provided that help as any decent man would. How gallant, Silas mocked. And I suppose you expect me to believe that's all there was to it, that you've been playing the Good Samaritan with no additional benefits. Ross's jaw tightened visibly. Your wife's virtue is intact, Sullivan, which speaks more to her character than yours from what I've heard. You know nothing about me or my wife, Silas snapped, his polished veneer cracking. I know enough, Ross replied evenly. I know that women don't run until their feet bleed unless they're terrified. I know that decent men don't hunt their wives like runaway slaves. Silas's face darkened with anger. You overstep, sir. The law is on my side. This woman is my wife, and I will be taking her with me. The law also has something to say about men who beat their wives, Ross countered. Or did you think those bruises she was wearing when I found her wouldn't raise questions? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Silas's face. He glanced at his men, then back at Ross. 2 against 1, Mr. Vance. Poor odds, even for a man of your apparent capabilities. 3 against 1, came a new voice. All heads turned to see Sheriff Hank Dawson riding into the clearing, his badge glinting in the late afternoon sun. A swarthy deputy flanked him. Sheriff, Silas recovered quickly, his charming smile returning. Perfect timing. I was just attempting to recover my wife from this mountain man who's been holding her against her will. Sheriff Dawson's weathered face remained impassive as he dismounted. That's so, he looked at Fiona. Madam, this man your husband, Fiona swallowed hard. Yes, but she ran away after we were attacked by Apaches, Silas interrupted smoothly. The poor dear was clearly addled by the experience. I've been searching for her for days. The sheriff studied Silas for a long moment, then turned to Ross. Vance, been a while. Dawson, Ross acknowledged with a nod. Didn't expect to see you out this way. Got word in town that Sullivan here was asking after his wife, saying she might be in these parts. The sheriff's gaze swept the tense tableau before him. Thought I'd ride out, make sure everything was on the up and up. Well, as you can see, Silas said impatiently, I've found my wife and am preparing to take her home. And where might that home be? Dawson asked mildly. We're establishing a residence near my silver interests at Bitter Creek, Silas replied. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Madam," he addressed Fiona directly, "I need to hear from you. Do you wish to return with your husband?" Silas's expression hardened in warning. Fiona looked from him to Ross, whose blue eyes held steady encouragement. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I do not. He beat me, Sheriff, regularly and severely. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances, and I have reason to believe he murdered her. Preposterous." Silas exploded. "She's clearly unhinged. Sheriff, I demand you assist me in taking custody of my wife." Sheriff Dawson held up a hand. "Hold on now. Those are serious allegations, madam. Do you have any proof?" "I have letters," Fiona said, "from his first wife's family questioning her death. They're in my trunk, which was lost in the Apache attack." "Convenient," Silas sneered. "Sheriff, this is absurd. You know as well as I do that a husband has legal right to his wife." "Law's not always as simple as that," Dawson replied, "especially out here." "I won't leave with him," Fiona stated firmly, moving to stand beside Ross's horse. "I'll die first." Something dangerous flashed in Silas's eyes. "You may get your wish, my dear." His hand moved suddenly toward his jacket and Ross's rifle swung up, but Sheriff Dawson was faster. His revolver appeared as if by magic, aimed directly at Silas's chest. "I wouldn't," the sheriff advised calmly. "Drawing on an officer of the law is a hanging offense in this territory." Silas froze, then slowly raised his hands, showing them empty. "This is outrageous. I'm simply trying to retrieve my lawful wife." "Maybe so," Dawson agreed, "but I don't much care for your methods or your tone." He holstered his weapon but kept his hand near it. "Here's what's going to happen. We're all going to ride into Silver Creek nice and peaceful. Judge Thornton's in town this week for circuit court. He can sort this out proper like." "I am not going anywhere with that man," Fiona declared, panic rising in her chest. "Madam, I give you my word he won't harm you," the sheriff assured her. "He'll ride with me and Deputy Garcia." "You can ride with Mr. Vance here." Silas's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "This is an outrage. I'll have your badge for this, Dawson." The sheriff seemed unimpressed. "You're welcome to try. Meantime, we're all going to town. Unless you'd prefer I arrest you here and now for threatening behavior." After a tense moment, Silas gave a curt nod. "Very well. We'll do this your way, Sheriff. For now." Ross dismounted and moved to Fiona's side. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her heart was still racing. "I'm afraid," she admitted in a whisper. "I know, but I won't let him hurt you again." Ross's voice held a promise that steadied her. "I need to get some things from the cabin. Will you be all right for a moment?" Fiona glanced at Silas, who was now under the watchful eye of the deputy. "Yes." While Ross went inside, Sheriff Dawson approached Fiona. "Madam, I don't mean to pry, but I need to ask, did Mr. Vance abduct you or hold you here against your will?" "No," Fiona said emphatically. "He saved my life. I was dying when he found me." The sheriff nodded. "That's what I figured. Vance has a reputation as a loner, but not a bad one." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, your husband's reputation ain't nearly so favorable." Hope stirred in Fiona's chest. "You've heard of him. Enough to make me wonder." Dawson straightened as Ross emerged from the cabin with a small pack. "Ready to ride, Vance." The journey to Silver Creek was tense and largely silent. Fiona rode behind Ross on Sadie, her arms wrapped around his waist, drawing strength from his solid presence. Silas and his men rode ahead with the sheriff and deputy, though Silas frequently turned in his saddle to glare at them. "What will happen in Silver Creek?" Fiona asked quietly. "Judge Thornton's fair-minded," Ross replied. "He'll hear both sides." "But the law favors Silas," Fiona reminded him. "A wife is her husband's property in the eyes of the law." Ross was quiet for a moment. "There might be a way," he said finally. But you won't like it. Tell me. Marriage is a contract, Ross explained. If you can prove Silas entered into it fraudulently by hiding his past, for instance, Judge Thornton might void it. And how would I prove that? We'd need to find someone who knows about his first wife's death, someone willing to testify. Fiona's heart sank. In the wilderness of New Mexico. It's impossible. Maybe not, Ross said thoughtfully. Silver Creek's grown since I was last there. Lot of miners coming through. Someone might know something. They reached the town as dusk was falling, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, dominated by a saloon at one end and a small church at the other. Between were the usual establishments of a frontier town: general store, blacksmith, small hotel, and sheriff's office. People stopped to stare as their strange procession made its way down the main street. Fiona felt their curious gazes and drew closer to Ross's back. Sheriff Dawson led them to the town's only hotel. Sullivan, you and your men take rooms here. The lady will stay at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house across the street, where I can ensure her safety. His tone brooked no argument. Judge Thornton will hear this matter tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Silas's jaw worked angrily, but he nodded. Very well. But I warn you, Sheriff, if my wife disappears during the night, I will hold you personally responsible. Noted, Dawson said dryly. Vance, you're welcome to a cell in the jailhouse if you need a place to sleep. Much obliged, Ross replied. I'd like to speak with Judge Thornton first, if he's available. He usually takes his evening meal at the Lucky Strike around 8. You might catch him there. As Silas and his men disappeared into the hotel, Fiona felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Ross helped her down from Sadie, careful of her tender feet. Mrs. Peterson's is just there, the sheriff said, pointing to a neat two-story house across the street. She's a good woman, discreet. I'll walk you over. I'll come too, Ross said, leading Sadie, Mrs. Peterson turned out to be a plump, gray-haired widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She asked no questions when Sheriff Dawson explained that Fiona needed safe lodging until a legal matter could be resolved, simply showing her to a clean, comfortable room at the back of the house. No men allowed upstairs after 8, she informed Ross firmly. Not even you, Mr. Vance, despite your reputation as a gentleman. Understood, madam, Ross agreed respectfully. When Mrs. Peterson had gone to prepare tea, Ross turned to Fiona. I'll speak to Judge Thornton tonight, see where we stand legally. What if he insists I return to Silas? Fiona asked, voicing her deepest fear. Ross's expression hardened. Then we'll have to find another way. He hesitated, then added quietly, my offer still stands if it comes to that. Fiona knew he meant marriage, a marriage of convenience that would supersede her vows to Silas. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Let's hope it doesn't, she replied, though with less conviction than before. After Ross left, Fiona ate a light meal with Mrs. Peterson, who chatted amiably without prying. Exhausted from the day's events, Fiona retired early, but sleep proved elusive. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. What if Judge Thornton sided with Silas? What if Ross's plan failed? What if Silas managed to get to her during the night? A soft tap at her window startled her from her anxious thoughts. She approached cautiously, drawing back the curtain to see Ross standing in the alley below. Fiona quietly raised the sash. What are you doing, Mrs. Peterson said. I know, but this couldn't wait, Ross interrupted. I've spoken with Judge Thornton. And Ross's expression was grim. He's sympathetic, but without evidence of Silas's treatment of you or his first wife. His hands are tied legally. Fiona's heart sank. So he'll order me to return to Silas? Not necessarily. He's agreed to hear arguments in the morning. But Fiona. Ross hesitated. I found something else. A man at the saloon recognized Sullivan's name, says he worked a claim near Sullivan's first operation in Colorado. Hope flared. Did he know anything about the first Mrs. Sullivan? He says everyone knew Sullivan beat her, and that when she died, there were rumors it wasn't fever that killed her. Will he testify? Ross shook his head. He's too afraid. Says Sullivan has men everywhere and he values his life. Tears of frustration welled in Fiona's eyes. So we're back where we started. Not quite. Ross's voice lowered further. There's a stage leaving for Santa Fe at dawn. If we left now, we could be 10 miles out before anyone realized you were gone. You're suggesting we run. I'm suggesting we get you somewhere beyond Sullivan's reach, while I gather the evidence we need. Fiona considered this. Running again meant acknowledging that the law couldn't or wouldn't protect her. But staying meant risking being returned to Silas's control. If we run, they'll hunt us both, she said finally. Let them try, Ross replied, a dangerous edge to his voice. I know this country better than Sullivan ever will. And if they catch us, they won't. Fiona looked at his face, illuminated in the soft moonlight, steady, determined, and somehow safe despite the danger he represented. In that moment, she made her decision. Give me 10 minutes to gather my things. Ross nodded. I'll wait at the end of the alley with the horses. Fiona quickly packed her few belongings into a small carpet bag Mrs. Peterson had lent her. She wrote a brief note apologizing for her sudden departure, left it on the bed, and quietly made her way downstairs and out the back door. Ross was waiting as promised, holding the reins of Sadie and a second horse, a sturdy-looking bay. Mrs. Peterson's nephew's mount, he explained. I left payment in his saddlebag. They rode out of Silver Creek under the cover of darkness, keeping to back trails and avoiding the main road. Ross set a grueling pace, pushing the horses as hard as he dared in the dark. Where are we going? Fiona asked when they paused briefly to rest the animals. Not Santa Fe, Ross replied. That's the first place they'll look. I know a place in the mountains, an old mining cabin that's been abandoned for years. We can lie low there while we figure out our next move. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached the foothills of the mountains. Ross led them up a barely visible trail that wound through dense pine forest, climbing steadily higher until the air grew noticeably cooler. Not much farther, he assured Fiona, who was swaying with exhaustion in her saddle. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend smaller than Ross's home, and clearly long abandoned, but with its roof and walls intact. Ross helped Fiona dismount and led her inside while he tended to the horses. The interior was dusty but sound. A small fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed filled the single room. Fiona sank onto one of the chairs, her feet throbbing painfully from the long ride. When Ross returned, he quickly built a fire and heated water for coffee. You should rest, he said, handing her a steaming cup. I'll keep watch. Ross, Fiona said hesitantly, I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to your door. He shook his head. You didn't bring it, Sullivan did. Still, you had a peaceful life before I stumbled into it. Ross's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Peaceful isn't the same as living, Fiona. I've been existing since Sarah and Emma died. Not much more than that. The simple honesty of his statement touched something deep inside her. Impulsively, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. Thank you for everything. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition, a possibility. Then Ross gently withdrew his hand and stood. Get some sleep. We've got hard days ahead. Fiona curled up on the narrow bed, expecting sleep to elude her despite her exhaustion. Instead, she drifted off almost immediately, feeling safer than she had any right to feel given their precarious situation. She woke to the sound of Ross moving quietly around the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the single window, indicating it was well into the day. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, sitting up. "About 8 hours," Ross replied, glancing over from where he was cleaning his rifle. "You needed it. Has there been any sign of pursuit?" "Nothing yet, but they'll be coming." He set the rifle aside. "I've been thinking about our options." Fiona swung her legs over the edge of the bed. "And we can keep running, but eventually our luck will run out." Ross's expression was somber. "Or we can try to find evidence about Sullivan's first wife, prove he's not fit to be anyone's husband." "How would we do that?" "Go to Colorado." "Maybe, but first I want to try something closer." Ross sat across from her at the small table. "There's a man in Santa Fe, Thomas Wheeler. Used to be a Pinkerton detective before he retired. If anyone can uncover the truth about Sullivan, it's him." "Can we trust him?" "With this, yes. He owes me a favor, a big one." Fiona considered this. "So we go to Santa Fe after all?" "No, too dangerous. I'll go alone. You'll be safer here." "Alone?" Alarm coursed through her. "Ross, if Silas's men find me here without you, they won't," he assured her. "This place is off any trail they'd know. There are supplies enough for a week, and you have the rifle. I'll show you how to use it before I go." "How long will you be gone?" 4 days, maybe 5. Santa Fe's not far as the crow flies, but I'll need time to find Wheeler and convince him to help." Fiona wanted to protest, to beg him not to leave her, but she recognized the logic of his plan. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but be careful." Ross's expression softened. "I will." He spent the rest of the day showing Fiona how to use the rifle, where he'd hidden extra ammunition, and how to cover her tracks if she needed to leave the cabin for any reason. He prepared meals for the days he would be gone, and made sure she had plenty of firewood and water. As evening fell, an awkward tension grew between them. Ross would leave at first light, and neither of them voiced the fear that they might not see each other again. "I should check the horses one more time," Ross said, rising from the table where they'd just finished a simple supper. When he returned, Fiona had made tea from the herbs he'd brought. They sat before the fire, the crackling flames the only sound in the small cabin. "Ross," Fiona said finally, breaking the silence, "if something happens, if you don't come back, I want you to know how grateful I am." "Don't talk like that," he said gruffly. "I'll be back." "But if you're not," she persisted, "I need you to know that you've shown me that not all men are like Silas. That kindness exists in this world, even for someone like me." Ross's blue eyes reflected the firelight as he turned to face her. "There's nothing someone like you about it, Fiona. You deserve kindness. You deserve a hell of a lot more than that." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "What do I deserve, Ross?" He looked away, back into the flames. "A life without fear. A home where you feel safe. Someone who sees your worth." "And who would that someone be?" Fiona asked, her heart pounding. Ross was silent for so long that Fiona thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she had to strain to hear him, he said, "In a better world, a man who could offer you more than a life on the run." The longing in his voice broke something open inside her. Without thinking, Fiona reached out and touched his face, turning it toward her. "I don't want a better world," she whispered. "I want this one, here, now." For a moment, Ross remained perfectly still. Then, with aching gentleness, he leaned forward and kissed her. The touch of his lips was tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, instead, she moved closer, her hands sliding into his hair. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and urgent. Ross pulled back first, his breathing unsteady. "Fiona, I don't want you to think." "I'm not thinking," she interrupted. "For once in my life, I'm just feeling." Something flared in his eyes, desire mingled with a protective tenderness that made her heart ache. He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You're still married," he reminded her, though the restraint clearly cost him. "Not in my heart," Fiona replied. "Never in my heart." This time when they came together, there was no hesitation. Ross's arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest as his mouth claimed hers with a hunger that matched her own. Fiona felt herself melting into him, all the fear and tension of the past weeks dissolving in the heat of his embrace. When he lifted her, carrying her to the narrow bed, Fiona felt no fear, only a sense of rightness, of coming home. His hands were gentle as they undressed each other, his eyes reverent as they took in her body in the firelight. "You're beautiful," he whispered, tracing the curve of her shoulder, the swell of her breast. Fiona saw herself reflected in his eyes and for the first time believed it might be true. With Silas, intimacy had been a duty, often painful, never desired. With Ross, each touch awakened sensations she had never experienced, each kiss a discovery. They came together slowly, learning each other's bodies with wonder and tenderness. And when Ross finally moved above her, his eyes holding hers, Fiona felt as if she was truly being seen for the first time in her life. After they lay tangled together on the narrow bed, Fiona's head resting on Ross's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare skin. "I've never—" Fiona began, then hesitated, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "Neither have I," Ross said, understanding what she couldn't say. "Not like this. Not even with Sarah." Ross was quiet for a moment. "Sarah was my childhood sweetheart. I loved her deeply, but we were different people. Young, what we had was sweet, but—" He tightened his arm around Fiona. "This is something else entirely." "I'm afraid," Fiona admitted softly, "of Sullivan, of this, of feeling so much." She raised herself on one elbow to look at him. "What if you don't come back?" Ross stroked her cheek. "I'll come back, I promise." "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered. "I keep my promises, Fiona Sullivan." His voice was firm. "And when I return, we'll find a way to make this right. Legally right. And if we can't, then we'll keep running until we find somewhere Sullivan can't reach us." Fiona laid her head back on his chest, listening to the conviction in his voice and wanting desperately to believe him. Dawn came too soon. They dressed in silence, both acutely aware of the coming separation. Ross packed quickly, efficiently, leaving Fiona with careful instructions and all the reassurance he could offer. At the door, he held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. 5 days, he promised. "No more," Fiona nodded, fighting back tears. "I'll be waiting." She watched from the doorway as he rode away, the morning mist swallowing him until only the sound of hoofbeats remained, and then nothing. The cabin felt immediately emptier, colder without his presence. Fiona forced herself to be practical, checking supplies, making sure the rifle was loaded and accessible, reviewing the escape route Ross had shown her. The first day passed slowly. Fiona kept herself busy with small tasks: cleaning, mending, preparing food. She practiced with the rifle, though the recoil bruised her shoulder. By evening, she was exhausted enough to sleep despite her anxiety. The second day was harder. Every sound from the forest made her jump, convinced Silas had found her. She found herself talking aloud just to break the silence, telling the empty room about her childhood in Boston, her dreams before she'd met Silas, her hopes for a future she was only beginning to imagine. On the third day, restlessness drove her outside despite Ross's warnings to stay hidden. She didn't venture far, just to a small stream near the cabin where she bathed and washed her clothes. The cool mountain air and sunshine lifted her spirits, making the waiting more bearable. The fourth day dawned cloudy and cool. Fiona woke with a sense of anticipation Ross might return today, or tomorrow at the latest. She busied herself preparing a meal for his return, using the last of the fresh provisions. Midday brought a light rain, pattering on the cabin roof. Fiona sat by the window, sewing by the gray light, letting her mind wander to the night she had spent in Ross's arms. A smile curved her lips at the memory. The sound of hoofbeats jolted her from her reverie. Fiona rushed to the window, her heart leaping then plummeting as she saw not Ross's familiar figure but 3 riders approaching through the rain, Sela's. Terror gripped her. How had he found them? There was no time to wonder. Fiona grabbed the rifle and her small bag of essentials, already packed as Ross had instructed. She slipped out the back door of the cabin just as the riders reached the front clearing. The rain helped cover her tracks as she fled into the forest. Following the escape route, Ross had carefully explained up the ridge behind the cabin, then down a deer trail that wound through dense underbrush behind her. She heard Sela's voice, sharp with command. Then the sound of the cabin door being kicked in. Fiona ran faster, ignoring the pain in her barely healed feet, the branches that whipped at her face. She reached the ridge and began the descent, her feet slipping on wet rocks and pine needles. Halfway down, her foot caught on an exposed root and she fell, tumbling several yards before coming to a stop against a tree trunk. Pain shot through her ankle when she tried to stand. A shout from above told her Sela's men had discovered her trail. Panic surged through her. She couldn't outrun them now, not with an injured ankle. Frantically, she searched for somewhere to hide. An outcropping of rocks nearby offered the only possibility. Fiona dragged herself toward it, rifle clutched awkwardly in one hand. Behind the largest boulder, she found a shallow space barely big enough to conceal her if she curled tightly. She wedged herself in, pulled some fallen branches over the opening, and tried to quiet her ragged breathing. The sound of men crashing through the underbrush grew louder. Fiona gripped the rifle, though she wasn't sure she could bring herself to use it. Would she really be able to pull the trigger if Sela's found her? She came this way, a gruff voice said, alarmingly close. See where she fell, spread out, came Sela's cultured tones. She can't have gone far. Footsteps moved around her hiding place. Fiona held her breath, pressing herself as far back into the crevice as possible. Over here, someone shouted. Tracks leading west, the footsteps receded. Fiona exhaled shakily but remained hidden. It could be a trick. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Rain continued to fall, soaking through her clothing, making her shiver. Her ankle throbbed painfully. Still, she didn't move, straining her ears for any sound of pursuit. Eventually, the forest fell silent except for the steady drip of rain. Fiona cautiously peered out from her hiding place. No sign of Sela's or his men. Had they really been fooled by whatever tracks they'd found, or were they lying in wait for her to emerge? She couldn't stay where she was indefinitely. Night would fall soon, bringing cold that could be deadly in her wet condition. She needed to find shelter, treat her ankle, and somehow warn Ross that Sela's had found their hideaway. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Fiona extracted herself from the crevice and tried to put weight on her injured ankle. It held barely, though each step sent jolts of agony up her leg. Using the rifle as a makeshift crutch, she began moving slowly, not back toward the cabin but deeper into the forest, away from the direction Sela's men had gone. The rain had stopped by the time darkness fell, but low clouds obscured any moonlight that might have helped guide her way. Fiona kept moving, afraid that stopping would mean surrender to cold, pain, and the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. She had no idea how long she had been walking when she heard the sound of water, not the gentle trickle of the stream near the cabin, but the rush of a larger body of water. A river. Hope flared. If she could reach the river, she might be able to cover her tracks more effectively. Ross had told her about a trading post downriver from their hideaway, a place where she might find help if the worst happened. The sound grew louder as Fiona limped forward. Finally, the trees thinned, and she found herself on a rocky bank overlooking a fast-flowing river, swollen with rain. In the faint starlight now filtering through breaks in the clouds, she could see that the far bank was steep, almost a cliff face. No crossing there. Fiona sank down on a boulder, despair washing over her. She was lost, injured, and alone in wilderness that would kill her as surely as Silas would if he found her. Ross wouldn't return to the cabin for at least another day, maybe longer, and by then, any trail she might have left would be cold. Tears slid down her face as she contemplated her options. She could try to follow the river downstream, hoping to reach the trading post Ross had mentioned. But how far was it? Could she make it with her injured ankle? Would anyone there help her, a strange woman alone? The alternative was to hide, wait, and hope that Ross somehow found her. But the wilderness was vast, and she had no way to signal him, no way to let him know she was alive. A twig snapped behind her. Fiona whirled, raising the rifle with shaking hands. "Don't shoot," came a familiar voice. Ross stepped from the shadows, his face haggard with exhaustion, his clothes as soaked as her own. Fiona nearly collapsed with relief. "Ross, how did you find me?" He crossed to her in 3 long strides, gathering her into his arms. "I saw Sullivan and his men on the trail as I was returning. Followed them to the cabin, then tracked you from there." He held her at arm's length, examining her in the dim light. "Are you hurt?" "My ankle," Fiona admitted. "I fell running away." Ross knelt to examine it, his touch gentle but sure. "Sprained, not broken, but we need to bind it." "Did Silas see you?" "No. They're still searching the western ridge last I saw, but they'll figure out they're on the wrong track soon enough." He straightened. "We need to move. Can you walk?" "If I must," Fiona said grimly. "Where will we go?" "There's a place downstream, a cave behind a waterfall. Hard to spot unless you know it's there." Ross stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "It'll be rough going, but we can make it before dawn if we push." Fiona stood, wincing as weight settled on her injured ankle. "Lead on." Ross fashioned a crude walking stick for her, then took the rifle, slinging it across his back. With his support, Fiona made her way along the riverbank, moving as quickly as her injury allowed. The terrain was treacherous, slippery rocks, fallen logs, stretches where they had to wade in the shallows of the river itself. Several times they stopped, listening for sounds of pursuit, but the night remained quiet except for the rush of water and the occasional call of night birds. "Did you reach Santa Fe?" Fiona asked during one such pause. "Did you find Wheeler?" Ross nodded. "I found him, and he had information more than I expected." "About Silas's first wife?" "Yes, and about other things." Ross's expression was grim in the faint moonlight. "Sullivan's first wife didn't die of fever. She was pushed from a cliff near their Colorado property. Wheeler has a witness, a housekeeper, who saw it happen. She's been afraid to come forward, but Wheeler convinced her to sign an affidavit." Hope surged through Fiona. "So we have proof. We can go to the authorities." "We can," Ross agreed. "But there's more. Sullivan's not just a murderer, he's a swindler. He's been selling fraudulent mining shares to Eastern investors. The territorial governor has issued a warrant for his arrest, but they haven't been able to find him." "So he's running too," Fiona realized. "That's why he's so desperate to find me. He thinks I know about his schemes." "Do you?" "I saw papers, letters about investments that didn't make sense. I didn't understand their significance at the time." Fiona shook her head. "He caught me looking at them the night before we left Boston. That's when he beat me worst of all." Ross's jaw tightened visibly. "Wheeler's bringing the affidavit and the warrant to Silver Creek. Sheriff Dawson will be waiting for Sullivan when he returns." "If he returns," Fiona said. If he doesn't find me first. He won't, Ross promised, helping her to her feet. Come on, not much farther now. They continued downriver, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they progressed. Eventually, a roaring filled the air, and Fiona could make out a pale ribbon of water cascading over rocks ahead, the waterfall Ross had mentioned. Getting to it proved challenging. They had to climb down a steep embankment, Ross practically carrying Fiona at points where her injured ankle threatened to give way. The rocks at the base of the falls were slick with spray, requiring careful navigation. Behind the falls, Ross shouted over the roar, pointing to where the curtain of water curved away from the rock face. There's a ledge, then the cave entrance. Follow me exactly. Heart in her throat, Fiona watched as Ross disappeared behind the thundering water. Taking a deep breath, she followed, clinging to the rock face as she edged along a narrow ledge partially concealed by the waterfall. Spray soaked her already wet clothing, making the footing even more treacherous. Just when she thought she would slip and be swept away, Ross's strong hand appeared, guiding her around a final outcropping and into the cave mouth. Inside, the roar of the falls was muted to a constant background rush. The cave was surprisingly large, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. The floor was sandy and dry except near the entrance. "How did you know about this place?" Fiona asked, collapsing onto the soft sand in exhaustion. "I spent a lot of time exploring these mountains after Sarah died," Ross replied, setting down the rifle. "Looking for Emma. I found a lot of places most folks don't know about." He moved efficiently around the cave, gathering driftwood that had apparently washed in during previous floods. Soon he had a small fire going, the smoke drawn upward and out through some unseen fissure in the rock ceiling. By the fire's light, Ross examined Fiona's ankle more thoroughly, wrapping it tightly with strips torn from his spare shirt. Then he helped her out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in a relatively dry blanket from his pack before changing himself. "You should rest," he said, settling beside her. "We're safe here for now." Fiona leaned against his shoulder, suddenly overcome with emotion. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. Ross's arm tightened around her. "I promised I'd come back. How did you find me in the dark, in all that wilderness?" A small smile touched his lips. "I was a tracker during the war." Following a limping woman with bleeding feet isn't exactly challenging. Fiona looked down, realizing for the first time that her feet were indeed bleeding again, her barely healed soles reopened by her desperate flight. "Just like when we met," she said softly. Ross nodded, his expression somber. "You've been running too long, Fiona. It's time to stop." "I'm not sure I know how anymore," she admitted. "Running is all I've done since I discovered what Silas really was." "Then I'll show you," Ross said simply. "When this is over, if it's ever over, it will be." His voice held such certainty that Fiona found herself believing him despite her fears. They slept curled together before the fire, the sound of the waterfall a constant lullaby. Fiona's dreams were troubled, filled with images of Silas pursuing her through endless forests, but each time she started awake, Ross's steady presence beside her calmed her racing heart. Morning brought watery sunlight filtering through the waterfall, casting rippling patterns across the cave walls. Ross was already up, rekindling the fire and preparing a simple meal from supplies in his pack. "How's the ankle?" he asked as Fiona stirred. She tested it carefully. "Better, I think." "Still painful, but I can put weight on it." "Good. We should stay here today, let it heal more before we move on." "Where will we go?" Fiona asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Back to Silver Creek," Ross said firmly. "With Wheeler's evidence and the governor's warrant, we can end this, legally end it." Fiona's heart raced at the thought, And if it works, if Silas is arrested, then you'll be free. Ross met her gaze steadily. Free to decide what you want. What she wanted was sitting right in front of her. Fiona realized this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything to help her. But she couldn't say that, not yet, not while Silas still stood between them. Instead, she asked, "How long until Wheeler reaches Silver Creek?" "Another day, maybe two. We'll wait here until tomorrow, then start back." Ross hesitated. "Fiona, there's something else you should know about Wheeler's investigation." The seriousness in his tone alarmed her. "What is it?" "Sullivan's been using different names in his schemes." One of them was Vance. Ross Vance. Shock coursed through her. "He's been using your name." "Why?" "Not just my name, my identity." Ross's expression was grim. 10 years ago, during a cattle drive to Denver, I lost everything in a poker game to a man calling himself James Blackwood. Turned out that everything included more than my money. It included papers proving who I was. Military discharge, land deed, bank drafts. I was young and stupid, and by the time I realized what had happened, he was gone. Blackwood was Silas, Fiona realized. Ross nodded. One of his aliases. He's been using my identity for some of his swindles ever since. That's why I've been living so remote, using only cash, avoiding towns where I might be recognized as the man who's been cheating folks. "That's why you were so willing to help me," Fiona said slowly. "You had your own score to settle with Silas." "At first, maybe," Ross admitted. "When you mentioned Sullivan, I wondered if there might be a connection. But Fiona..." He reached out, taking her hand. "That's not why I stayed. That's not why I'm here now." The sincerity in his eyes left no room for doubt. Fiona squeezed his hand. "I know." They spent the day in the cave, Ross leaving only briefly to check for signs of pursuit. He returned with fresh fish from the river, which they cooked over the fire. As evening fell, they sat side by side watching the play of firelight on the cave walls. The enormity of what awaited them in Silver Creek hung between them, unspoken but ever-present. "Ross," Fiona said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "if this works, if Silas is arrested and my marriage is annulled, what happens then?" He was quiet for a moment, stirring the fire with a stick. "That depends on what you want, I suppose. What if I want to stay with you?" The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back too long. Ross turned to look at her, the firelight illuminating the hope and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "Is that what you want?" "Yes," Fiona said simply. "It's what I've wanted since that night in the cabin. Maybe since the moment you found me in the desert and said I could stop running." A smile slowly spread across Ross's face, transforming his weathered features. "Then that's what we'll do. My cabin needs work. A proper lady like you deserves better, but we can expand it, make it a real home." "I don't need much," Fiona assured him. "Just somewhere safe, someone who sees me." "I see you, Fiona Sullivan," Ross said softly, reaching out to cup her face. "I've seen you from the first moment." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and possibility, of a future neither had dared imagine until now. The journey back to Silver Creek took longer than anticipated. Though Fiona's ankle improved daily, she still couldn't move quickly over the rough terrain. Ross set a careful pace, watchful for any sign of Silas or his men. They reached the town on the afternoon of the third day, approaching cautiously from the hills above. Ross left Fiona hidden while he scouted ahead, returning with both good and concerning news. "Wheeler's here," he reported. "I saw him at the sheriff's office, but there's no sign of Sullivan or his men." "Could they have given up and left?" Fiona asked hopefully. Ross shook his head. "Not likely. My guess is they're still searching the mountains for you, or waiting somewhere to ambush us when we return." "What do? We go in after dark. Straight to the sheriff's office. Once you're under Dawson's protection with Wheeler's evidence in hand, Sullivan won't be able to touch you legally. The plan was simple, but Fiona's nerves were strung tight as they waited for nightfall. So much could still go wrong. Silas could be watching the town. The evidence might not be enough. The law might still favor a husband's rights over a wife's accusations. As darkness fell, they made their way down to Silver Creek, avoiding the main street and keeping to the shadows. The sheriff's office was at the far end of town, its windows glowing with lamplight. They were halfway there when Ross suddenly froze, pulling Fiona into a narrow alley between buildings. "What is it?" she whispered. "Sullivan's men," Ross breathed in her ear. "By the hotel, looking this way." Fiona peered around him and saw them, the two rough-looking men who had accompanied Silas to the cabin. They were standing on the hotel porch, scanning the street with the alertness of predators. "They haven't seen us," Ross whispered, "but we need to change course. Follow me." He led her behind the buildings, working their way toward the sheriff's office from the rear. They had almost reached it when a voice called out from the darkness. "That's far enough." Silas stepped from the shadows, a revolver held steady in his hand. He looked disheveled, his elegant clothing stained and torn, his handsome face haggard with exhaustion and fury. "Silas," Fiona breathed, instinctively pressing closer to Ross. "My darling wife," Silas drawled, his cultured accent more pronounced in his anger. "And her mountain man protector." "How touching." Ross pushed Fiona slightly behind him. "It's over, Sullivan. Put the gun down." Silas's laugh was cold. "I think not. Step away from my wife, Vance, or whatever your real name is." "You know damn well what my real name is," Ross replied evenly, "since you've been using it yourself." A flicker of surprise crossed Silas's face, quickly masked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "James Blackwood, Denver, 1865. Ross's voice was deadly quiet. "You stole more than my money that night." Recognition dawned in Silas's eyes. "The cattle driver. Well, small world indeed." His smile was reptilian. "You should thank me. I've made your name quite famous in certain circles." "Infamous is more like it," Ross countered. "The territorial governor has issued a warrant for your arrest, Sullivan, for fraud, embezzlement, and murder." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Silas's expression. "You're bluffing." "Thomas Wheeler's in town," Ross continued. "Brought evidence about what really happened to Elizabeth Prescott Sullivan, your first wife, the one you pushed off a cliff when she discovered your schemes." Silas's face contorted with rage. "You know nothing." "I know everything," Ross replied calmly. "And so will the courts. It's over, Sullivan. Drop the gun." For a tense moment no one moved. Then, with terrifying suddenness, Silas's aim shifted from Ross to Fiona. "If I can't have her, no one will," he snarled. Several things happened at once. Ross lunged for Silas as the gun fired. Fiona screamed, and Silas crumpled to the ground, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Behind him stood Sheriff Dawson, his smoking revolver still aimed where Silas had stood. "You all right?" the sheriff asked, his gaze sweeping over Ross and Fiona. Ross nodded, pulling Fiona into his arms. She was trembling violently but unharmed. "Heard the commotion," Dawson explained, kneeling to check Silas. "Been expecting trouble since Wheeler showed up with those papers." He looked up grimly. "He's dead." Fiona sagged against Ross, a complex wave of emotions washing through her: relief, shock, and an unexpected grief for the man Silas might have been in another life. "His men?" Ross asked. "Deputies got them at gunpoint over by the hotel," Dawson replied, standing. "Seems they were more hired guns than loyal friends. Surrendered quick enough when they saw the badges." Everything after that was a blur for Fiona. The sheriff's office, bright with lamplight. Thomas Wheeler, a grizzled man with shrewd eyes, presenting documents that proved Silas's crimes. Questions, statements, signatures on official papers. And through it all, Ross's steady presence at her side, his hand warm in hers when the questions became difficult, his voice calm when explaining how they had met, how he had helped her escape. The marriage was fraudulent from the start, Wheeler explained to Judge Thornton, who had been summoned from his bed at the hotel. Sullivan was still legally married to his first wife when he wed Miss Sullivan. There was never a divorce, as Elizabeth Sullivan was never declared legally dead, just missing. So I was never truly his wife? Fiona asked, stunned. Legally speaking, no, the judge confirmed, studying the documents before him, which simplifies matters considerably. He looked up at Fiona. You're a free woman, miss. What was your maiden name? Sullivan, Fiona said with a small smile at the irony. It was always Sullivan. Judge Thornton wrote something on an official-looking document, signed it with a flourish, and handed it to her. Well, Miss Sullivan, consider yourself officially unattached, and my apologies for the ordeal you've suffered. Dawn was breaking by the time they left the sheriff's office. Ross led Fiona to Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, where the widow welcomed her back with open arms and no questions. You should rest, Ross said at the door to her room. It's been a long night. Fiona caught his hand as he turned to go. Where will you be? Getting a room at the hotel. We both need sleep. Then, he hesitated. Then we need to talk about what comes next. I already know what comes next, Fiona said quietly. I told you in the cave. Ross's eyes searched hers. You've been through a lot, Fiona. Silas is dead. You're free now, truly free. You might feel differently in the light of day. I won't, she said firmly. But I understand if you need time to be sure of your own feelings. A small smile touched his lips. I'm sure of my feelings. Have been since I found you in the desert, but a lady deserves proper courting, not just being swept along in the wake of danger. Then court me, Fiona suggested. Starting tomorrow. Ross's smile widened. Yes, madam, I believe I will. True to his word, Ross began a proper courtship the very next day. He arrived at Mrs. Peterson's door with wildflowers gathered from the hills, wearing a clean shirt borrowed from the general store. He took Fiona to dinner at the hotel's dining room, the first proper meal she'd had in a restaurant since leaving Boston. They spent the next week in Silver Creek, while the legal matters surrounding Silas's death and crimes were settled. Ross's name was officially cleared as Wheeler's investigation revealed the extent of Silas's identity theft. The funds from Silas's accounts were seized, but Judge Thornton ruled that a portion should go to Fiona as compensation for her suffering. I don't want his money, Fiona protested when Ross told her. Think of it as restitution, Ross suggested. Use it to build something good. The idea took root in Fiona's mind. By the time they were ready to leave Silver Creek, she had a plan, one she shared with Ross on their last evening in town, as they walked along the creek that gave the settlement its name. I want to use the money to build a proper home, she said. Not just for us, but for others who need sanctuary. Women running from men like Silas, children who have nowhere to go. Ross stopped walking, turning to face her. You want to build a refuge, Fiona nodded. On your land if you're willing. There's plenty of space, you said. We could expand the cabin, add other small structures over time. Create a place where people can heal, learn to be safe again. The look Ross gave her was filled with such pride and love that Fiona's heart felt too full for her chest. I think, he said slowly, that's the most perfect idea I've ever heard. You don't mind sharing your solitude? Ross shook his head. My solitude was just loneliness with a fancier name, Fiona. What you're suggesting, it's what I've been searching for since I lost Sarah and Emma, a way to make meaning out of what happened. He took her hands in his. But are you sure it's what you want? A life in the wilderness, far from the comforts you knew in Boston. Those weren't comforts, Fiona said firmly. They were just gilded bars. What I want is exactly what you offered me that first day, a chance to stop running, a place to belong, someone to belong to. Ross's hands tightened on hers. Fiona Sullivan, he said, his voice rough with emotion, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not for convenience, not for protection, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love again. Tears blurred Fiona's vision as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, with all my heart. They were married the next day in Silver Creek's small church, with Sheriff Dawson and Mrs. Peterson as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, the celebrations modest, but as Ross slipped a plain gold band onto Fiona's finger, she knew she had never been happier in her life. They returned to Ross's cabin, their cabin now 3 days later. The journey was easier this time, with proper horses for both of them and no fear of pursuit. As they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, Ross reined in his horse. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he said, reaching over to take her hand. Fiona looked at the simple log structure nestled against the backdrop of mountains and forest. It wasn't grand, it wasn't elegant, but it was theirs and it was safe. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "I like the sound of that." The years that followed were busy ones as they worked to make Fiona's vision a reality. The cabin was expanded, additional small structures built nearby. The first woman arrived 6 months after their marriage, a young mother fleeing an abusive husband with 2 small children in tow. Others followed, some staying only long enough to heal and move on, others becoming permanent parts of the growing community. Ross taught the women practical skills: how to hunt, track, defend themselves. Fiona taught reading, writing, and the gentle art of learning to trust again. Together, they created what became known throughout the territory as Sanctuary Ridge, a place of healing and new beginnings. 3 years after their marriage, Fiona gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. A son, Daniel, followed 2 years later. Their children grew strong and free in the mountain air, surrounded by an extended family of those who had found refuge at the ridge. On the 5th anniversary of the day Ross had found Fiona in the desert, they stood together on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their children played nearby with the other youngsters who called the ridge home, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "You ever regret it?" Ross asked, his arm around Fiona's waist. "Choosing this life?" Fiona looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, the lines of laughter now outnumbering those of worry, the blue eyes still as kind as the day they'd first met. "Never," she said truthfully. "Not for a single moment." Ross bent to kiss her, the gesture as natural as breathing after 5 years together. "Nor I," he murmured against her lips. "You can stop running now," I said. Best words I ever spoke. Fiona smiled, remembering that day, the desperation that had driven her across the desert, the bleeding feet that had carried her to freedom, and the man who had been waiting at the end of her long flight. "I did stop running," she said softly. "I stopped running and I started living instead." As the last light faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, holding each other, surrounded by the life they had built from the ashes of their separate sorrows, a life of purpose, of meaning, and of love that had healed them both in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day when a desperate woman ran until her feet bled, and a lonely cowboy told her she could finally stop running.